Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us tonight with Mr. Alex Prud'Homme talking about his book, Dinner with the President. Glad you can join us for our Dearborn Library program. Just one little thing about the format tonight. We'll aim for about, say, 40 minutes of talking or so, give or take, and then have maybe 10 minutes of questions and answers. So first off, I want to introduce Mr. Alex Prud'Homme. He's a freelance writer. His work has been in the New Yorker and the New York Times, and he's probably most famous for being the co-author of Julia Child's book, My Life in France. So it's a great pleasure, and I want to say, please welcome Mr. Alex Prud'Homme.
Thank you, Dan. Good to be here.
So I figure you have this nice PowerPoint deck up, and we'll get started. I guess in the book itself, you have a very nice introduction where you tell about how you came up with the idea of the book. I think, did you want to share how you came up with it?
Sure. It happened in kind of three phases. The first phase was that I grew up in a family of foodies, people who like to cook and eat. And we also like to sit around the dinner table and talk about politics or argue about it. And that was kind of the background. And then I was very lucky to have as my great aunt, Julia Child, the French chef. And Julia and her husband, Paul, were pretty close to us. We would spend Thanksgivings with them. We'd see them 3 or 4 or 5 times a year. We lived in New York City. They lived in Cambridge, Mass. You know, when you went over to Julia's place, she would just put everybody to work, and we'd all just start cooking and bringing the wine up from the cellar and setting the table and helping out. And then afterwards, we'd all clean up, and she made even that part fun. So she was a great example to me for how to live. I discovered when I was writing her memoir, which is called My Life in France, that she had spent some time at the White House. She and Paul had been diplomats during the 50s and 60s. They started in France, where Julia learned to cook, and then they went to Germany and Norway, and they spent some time in Washington. And one of the things that came out of the book was that she, while at the White House, she did 2 televised documentaries about state dinners for foreign leaders. The first was in 1967, hosted by Lyndon Johnson for Prime Minister Sato of Japan, during the Vietnam War and the protests on the streets of America. Johnson was kind of hunkered down in the White House, not talking to the press much, but if anybody could charm Lyndon Johnson, it was Julia Child. As Paul liked to say, she could charm a polecat. The entertainment that night after this wonderful dinner cooked by Chef Henry Holler was Tony Bennett singing his jazz hits. Flash forward another 9 years, and in 1976, she did the same thing for Gerald Ford hosting Queen Elizabeth and Prince Philip during the bicentennial. She did a behind-the-scenes look at the state dinner. Only this time, things went a little askew. This was a big deal. It was the bicentennial. It was Queen. Gerald Ford was running for re-election. They had this meticulously planned evening, a beautiful white tent over the Rose Garden next to the White House. And right before the ceremony was supposed to begin, a terrible rainstorm swept off the Potomac River and doused everybody, flooded the tent, got Julia wet. But they carried on, regrouped, and the evening continued in a strange vein. Bob Hope's jokes kind of fell flat. When Queen Elizabeth was dancing with Gerald Ford, the Marine Band inadvertently struck up "The Lady is a Tramp." And the kicker for me was that the entertainment at the end of the night was the captain and Tennille warbling about muskrat love, Julia deemed rather unqueenly. But nevertheless, she had a great time being at the White House with the Queen, who was one of the few celebrities that she was actually impressed by. You know, she took it upon herself to really promote the White House kitchen and the White House chefs. And I'll show you a slide. There's the White House on a beautiful spring day. There's Julia with Chef Henry Holler in 1976. And if you look closely on the lower left, you'll notice that she's in her bare feet. And that's because Julia was a little over 6'2", and Henry Holler was about 5'6". And here he is showing her this beautiful lobster dish with medallions of lobster tail and roe, and it was a fantastic dish. But she didn't want to tower over him too much, so she took her shoes off. So she always had fun there. But that got me interested in state dinners as a phenomenon. I'd heard of them. I didn't really know that much about them, so I started researching them. And I looked into Julia's relationship with Chef Holler and the White House, and it turns out that she went back quite a few times and really promoted the White House and its food, and got encouraged administrations to treat food as seriously as the French do and to promote regional cuisine. So, for example, when the Carters succeeded the Fords, they came in with their Georgia cuisine, which was real Southern cooking. And Julia thought that was fantastic, and she encouraged them to not only do the Southern cooking, but also bring in maybe a Yankee chef and someone from the Pacific Northwest and someone from Texas and Florida and so on, to sort of show off the best of American cooking. And I thought that was pretty great. And then I sort of tucked that away. And in 2016, I was invited to give a short talk at the White House to mid-level staff in the Obama administration. I had written a book about fresh water. It's called The Ripple Effect. And it's about why I think water will be the defining resource of this century. And so I talked to some of the Department of Environmental Protection folks. And I had a friend in the Obama administration, and he said, well, you're coming here. Why don't we have lunch? And I said, great. And he took me to the Navy Mess, which is perhaps the world's most unusual cafeteria. It's in the ground floor of the White House next to the Situation Room. It looks kind of like the stateroom aboard the presidential yacht, and it's staffed by Navy personnel. And then we did a quick tour of the White House. The Obamas were gone. They were in Martha's Vineyard in August. And so we had the place to ourselves, and we zipped around and looked into the Oval Office and the state dining room. And I watched the executive kitchen at work, because they're always doing something down there. And as we walked through the White House, which I had not visited before, I was struck by the busts and the portraits of the presidents and first ladies, and seeing those rooms that I had seen in photographs for many years. And it just hit me in an emotional way that I was not expecting at all. It really impacted me. I felt the history almost palpably. And I think, without realizing it, that this book was planted right in that moment. But I was busy with other projects. It took me another couple of years to dig in on this idea. But in the fall of 2018, I sat down and started investigating state dinners, and that led to my book, Dinner with the President.
Well, Julia, you think you mentioned the book that Julia Child's documentaries both times were she wanted to show the effort involved in creating and making and baking all the state dinners for all these people.
Yeah, the state dinner is the culmination of diplomatic talks between America and a guest nation. The first one was held in 1874 by U.S. Grant, who hosted King Kalakaua of the Sandwich Islands, which we now call Hawaii. And there's usually an economic or political backstory to these events. In his case, the Sandwich Islands were an independent nation at that point, and they had a lot of sugar to sell, but the U.S. had very high sugar tariffs. And so Kalakaua came to Washington as the first guest at a first date dinner. And President U.S. Grant welcomed him, and they sat down and negotiated a deal where we would lower our tariffs, allowed Hawaiian sugar in, on the condition that they open up Pearl Harbor as a naval base for the U.S. And a lot of the islanders were worried by this. They thought it might mean the end of their kingdom, and ultimately they were right. But it was a fantastic event because there was a big parade through Washington, and Kalakaua was a big hearty guy, loved to eat. Grant had a chef named Valentino Mela, who was a wonderful cook, and he produced a 30-odd course meal. And Kalakaua had two food tasters that stood on either side of him, stone-faced, and tried everything just to make sure he wasn't going to get poisoned. And it was a great success. And so that set the template for the state dinners that is more or less the same today. And so Julia's idea, and Paul's, her husband's, was to show a side of the People's House that the people have never seen before. And, most Americans were like me. They'd heard of state dinners, but they didn't know much about them. So Julia explained what they are, why they're important, and why they remain relevant all these years later. And they are a phenomenon. They can take months of planning and, $500,000 to several $1 million to produce. There have been some phenomenal state dinners for people like Nelson Mandela or Gorbachev. And so they're really markers of history and important.
Well, I've just been fascinated by the idea of just how much work. I mean, if you're hosting like 1,200 people or 300 people, how much it's, I think from reading in the book, you said the cooks are often there from morning till night just to fix everything.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It's a very prestigious job, but it's not a particularly well-paid job. So you have to be somebody who doesn't mind the pressure and the spotlight of the White House. You have to be somebody willing to work long hours, and you have to work collaboratively. It's a very collaborative place. And you have to be discreet. If you start talking out of turn, then you lose your job. And this is a security issue. And so, the production behind a state dinner is phenomenal, and the food is often superb. It's highly choreographed, all of this stuff, and the meals are planned out in advance with the cooks and the State Department and the ambassadors and the office of the guest coming, and it really is very carefully planned. And when a chef cooks a state dinner, he or she will generally nod to the guest country with an ingredient or a color or a type of wine or something. There'll be some nodding to the guest, but it also is a moment to present the best of American food and cooking technique. So it's a real kind of it's almost like a stage on which they get to perform.
Is there a cuisine, a national cuisine, or is it just American cuisine? Because French has French cooking, German has German cooking, but is there a national cuisine that people could focus on, I guess?
Well, you're wading into a decades-long battle, Dan. That's a very good question. Is there an American cuisine? I would argue that yes, there is. And I would say that it probably began way back in the beginning when the colonists came to North America and brought their techniques and their recipes and their, favorite ideas about food and some of their implements. I think it really began to be codified by Thomas Jefferson, who was our first and perhaps our greatest Epicurean president. He was a real foodie, and he really understood the way that food can be used as a political and diplomatic tool as well. which some presidents don't understand. And he had a very talented slave cook named James Hemings, who he had brought to Paris when he was the ambassador there and trained in some of the best kitchens in Paris. So James Hemings is a remarkable guy who there probably should be a movie about him. But he was a wonderful cook. He could speak French better than Jefferson. He was literate. He could read and write. And yet he was a slave. While in France, he was being paid, so he made some money. And when he came back to the States with Jefferson, because of the French Revolution, they hosted a series of really important dinners, and Jefferson really began to use food as a way to communicate with people and to, broker deals and break bread and get to know people. So fast forward to, people like Jackie Kennedy, who had a great vision for entertaining at the White House, starting in 1961 when she hired René Verdun, a French chef, and began to host wonderful parties. And then up to the modern day, where you have people like Nancy Reagan, who emulated Jackie, the Obamas, the Clintons, George W. Bush in his own style, using sort of Texas-themed meals, and arguably Donald Trump and Joe Biden is just starting to do that now. So there's been a long history of these state dinners and official dinners, which are different, and it's a way of bringing people together and having frank conversations. And as Nancy Reagan liked to say, you get a lot of business done at these dinners.
Well, I guess that leads to the next question, the meaning of the word commensality.
Yeah. So commensality is a term that's gained some traction lately, as gastronomic history has gained in popularity. And it's a term borrowed from biology, and it essentially means sharing the table. In biology, it means organisms that share resources in a compatible way. They're not fighting over things. And that's sort of the idea behind commensality. And so it refers to expanding the communal table, both literally and figuratively. Literally expanding the table by, adding more chairs to the communal table, putting more place settings down, inviting more people, and figuratively by inviting different kinds of people, and really expanding the idea of who should be a guest and who should be a host at a dinner. And so commensality has kind of become a term of art that's being used now to talk about, to get back to your previous question, the American cuisine has really become a fusion cuisine. Jefferson brought Hemings back, and between the two of them, they created what became known as Virginia cooking, which is to use indigenous American ingredients like corn and venison and wild turkey, with French technique, British recipes, the slaves' herbs and spices, and their own inventiveness to create a real beginning of a real fusion cuisine that was distinctly American. And today, the nation is much more polyglot. And so the fusion cooking has gotten even more expansive. It includes Asian and Latin influences. And so the notion of commensality kind of fits into this notion of expanding our vision for what is acceptable and indeed what is desired by the public and the president.
Yeah, and I was just amazed. It must have been neat to research all the different presidents and find out little facts and figures, or at least me as a history major would find that interesting. How like Dolly Madison was a great host, and all the little things she did nor because her husband James he sounded like a real introvert. He wasn't up for a lot of entertaining.
Yeah, they were an interesting couple. James Madison was a Virginia slaveholder, kind of an intellectual. He was very interested in politics, but not so interested in entertaining. Dolly Madison was very interested in entertaining and used to dress in these fabulous outfits and wear a big peacock feather in her hair so that people could see her across the room. And she, people say that she single-handedly kept the the fractions in Washington together by hosting these weekly parties. Wednesday nights, she'd have what they called a squeeze. And they'd call them Mrs. Madison's squeeze because they were so popular that you had to squeeze into the room. And, sometimes tempers would flare and she would calm people down and sometimes give them a pinch of snuff from her snuff box. But she was very careful not to betray her own political leanings other than defending her husband. And if you displeased her and went after her husband, she would disinvite you to the squeezes. And that was considered purgatory because this is where all the action was happening. And so Dolly Madison was kind of the first real modern first lady. She really established the role in the way that modern first ladies use it. And she was very effective. Each administration, each era has its own food and its own ways of doing things. And one of the things I found fascinating was the development of a new kind of American etiquette and manners. We didn't want to be just like the British or the French. We wanted to have our own system. And it took a while to develop a set of rules by which we eat together. And so Thomas Jefferson, for example, made sure that everybody sat at a round or oval table so that there was no sort of power seat. It was like the Knights of the Round Table. Everybody was equal, which was a very American idea. And he didn't like getting all dressed up for dinner. And he didn't like the formality of the British. And that annoyed the British ambassador and his wife greatly, which I think was partly the point. And so it slowly but surely we developed a sort of a system of American etiquette, which people overlook. But etiquette's important because let's not forget, we have a nation of immigrants from all over the world. We didn't have a single shared set of values. And so this was a way of getting everybody to essentially behave in the same way with the same expectations. And it did take a while, but it eventually proved effective.
Well, yeah, you talk about President Washington's time. Literally, people ate with their fingers. And they would often give toasts to your health, to your health, to your health, to everybody in the room. And by that time, everybody was like, can we get on eating? Because it took so much time.
Yeah, and it was so elaborate. And I remember one of the French administrators was appalled by this because it took forever, and he thought it was barbarous that he had to sit there listening to all these toasts over and over again, which was kind of a holdover from the British days. But as you said, there were people from the frontier who were members of Congress who came into town, and they literally did not know how to use a fork. And they'd throw their chicken bones over their shoulders, and they would, burp at the table and whatever, they'd carry on as they were used to. And so I think the early presidents felt that there needed to be a little order restored to dining together.
But the choices that presidents make in their daily menus and their snacks also have a great impact on the country and the economy itself. Say like, yeah. Yeah.
There's an example.
and broccoli, and Mr. First Bush.
Yes, George H.W. Yeah. Well, that's a funny story because, here's the guy who became president, George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, and he never liked broccoli. He had a kind of a hissy fit. He said, my mother used to make me eat broccoli, and now I'm the president, and I'm not going to eat broccoli anymore, and I don't like it. At which point the broccoli farmers were outraged because they were afraid it was going to ruin their business. And so they shipped 10 tons of broccoli to Washington in protest and dumped it at the White House. And at which point Barbara Bush stepped up and said, well, I like broccoli. We'll definitely use some of this, and the rest we'll give to the homeless shelters and soup kitchens. And the funny thing is that there was a state dinner for the head of Poland. And in Poland, they don't eat broccoli. And they did not understand what was going on. And of course, the whole episode became known as Broccoli Gate. And so the Poles are wandering around saying, what is Broccoli Gate? So we have our quirks. The thing I concluded was that every meal at the White House means something, and every bite counts. So you have here a picture of Ronald Reagan with a jar of jelly beans, which seems like a sort of a simple candy, right? But when you look into it, it tells multiple stories. It talks about how he weaned himself off of tobacco. It talks about the power of the sugar industry. It talks about how food can be a great connector for us human beings. When you see somebody wearing a shirt you like, you think, oh, that's a nice shirt, but not much more than that. But when you see somebody eating a food you like, it somehow goes into our prehistoric brain and it tells us, oh, this person I can trust. He's from the same tribe as me. He eats the same food I do. Therefore, I like him. And I talked to some experts who've studied this, and it's a very powerful motivator that we're not even aware of. But something about food really connects us. The other thing is that when we eat together, it releases endorphins, which are the feel-good opioids that we have in our bodies. And that encourages us to eat together more, which is a survival technique. And it's a very interesting phenomenon that, even if we disagree with each other, we still like to break bread and eat together. So the particulars of the Reagan jelly bean story are interesting because he was promoting jelly beans, which was a very popular thing. But at the same time, he cut the school lunch budget by $1.5 billion. At the same time that he allowed just 5 dining rooms in Washington to spend that $1.5 billion at the Pentagon. And when he cut the school lunch budget, he decided that ketchup would substitute as a vegetable. And ketchup, as you may know, is very sugary. It's very sweet. So he's promoting sweet candies, promoting ketchup as a vegetable. And it just happened by bad luck, bad timing, that Nancy Reagan had bought a new set of White House china, which it's a beautiful set. It's red and white, but it costs a lot of money. And there was a huge public uproar from all sides of the political spectrum that forced Reagan to backtrack on the school budget cuts and to distract people with other things. But yet the jelly beans remained a popular trope. And in fact, people made portraits of Reagan out of jelly beans and left jelly beans at his grave after he died. So they endure today.
No, I've heard this before, but I just get confirmation from you. The presidents and themselves are responsible for the cost of the food they eat during the time they're in office, and also the food that they serve with parties.
Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon. When they hold a state dinner or an official dinner, the federal government picks up the tab. And if in the case of a state dinner, it would be the State Department that would do that. But when they have friends over, or even an official dinner that's not, you know, a big deal, they are required to pay for it out of their salary. And this goes back to the early days. The first inhabitant of the White House was John Adams, our second president, who came from Quincy, Massachusetts. So he was a farmer and a real intellect. And he and his wife, Abigail, were the first couple to live at the White House. And back then, there was no real budget much for entertaining. And so they were required to pay out of their pocket, and they did not have a lot of money. In contrast to somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who you know, had a plantation and was quite wealthy, and served huge opulent meals. And the Adams would serve more meager meals, I guess you could say. They're Yankee meals, and they were perfectly good. They just weren't opulent. And so this tradition has been sustained. And it's a point of some surprise to some first families. I mean, when the Carters first moved into the White House, they had a whole bunch of friends from Georgia come by, and then were shocked by the food bill that they were given after that, and immediately stopped inviting people, and required the kitchen to you know, use leftovers and buy cheaper products, and really tighten the belts. So you know, it works in funny ways. And then you know, and the modern presidents, the same thing.
Well, in doing all your research, what stood out for you, or what surprised you? Be it a person or a process or a thing?
Oh, there are many things. Well, let's start with the people. There were several presidents who I was very surprised to learn more about. I think about someone like Dwight Eisenhower, who my preconception of him was a kind of black and white, square general, America's dad kind of guy. But when I looked into his biography and kind of looked at him through a culinary lens, I was really impressed by him. He was a much more complicated and multicolored guy than I thought. He was raised in Abilene, Kansas, on a farm. He learned to hunt and fish, and to a certain extent to cook, from an illiterate woodsman. And he just loved it. I ended up concluding that he was our best cook as a president, and Jimmy Carter was a second. And he Mamie, his wife, did not like to cook, so he cooked for the family. As a general, he made sure that his troops were well fed, which was a real advantage on the battlefield, particularly at a place like D-Day. After the Army, he was the president of Columbia University here in New York, and caused a sensation when he gave the student paper one of his personal recipes. It's a 2-page hand-typed recipe for 2-day vegetable soup. And I've made this thing, and it's incredible. You start with a giant beef bone, and you boil it down, and the whole house smells of beef broth, and you add vegetables, and you just boil it down and boil it down. It's pretty great. And it caused a sensation, and it was reprinted all across the country in newspapers. And he said for all of his time at Columbia, that was the single biggest splash he ever made. And then when he was president, he was cooking all the time. He would go up to the roof, and he would grill corn on the cob, or he would make what became known as Eisenhower steak, where you get some good quality coals, and you burn them down, and then you stick the steak right into the coals, into the embers, not on the grill. And you sear it on one side, and then you flip it over, and you sear it on another side, and you nice pink interior. It's really good and really easy. And for those who are interested, in the back of my book, I have 10 presidential recipes, including Eisenhower steak, and I tell that little story. So he was an example of somebody who was completely different than I thought. And in terms of the White House itself, I just did not understand what an incredible place it is. It is the most powerful house in the world, which I kind of knew. But it is also a very fine decorative arts museum. It is the nerve center of the Western world. And it is an actual functioning home. The first family lives in the second and third floors. When you look at the White House, there's a central part of the White House, and they live on the second and third floors, right in that central part. And then there's the East Wing and the West Wing, which are offices. And then there's a whole complex of other buildings behind it. It's kind of a compound. And it's just a remarkable system of spaces. And there's so much history there, as I mentioned earlier. It's just a phenomenal place. I recommend everybody go and visit. And I also recommend that you go visit the presidential homes. I started this book in 2018, and I intended to see a lot of the presidential homes because that really brings history alive. And I made it to 6 or 7 when COVID hit, and suddenly everything shut down. But I got enough done that I could actually describe some of these places, and they're just phenomenal. And one of the things I like is it makes these godlike figures, the presidents, more human. Their tastes and their quirks come through, and food can be an intimate thing. It can reveal a lot about a person. I'm going to show you this. So this is, for example, Richard Nixon's last lunch. And it was a lunch he had often. It's a dollop of cottage cheese on a pineapple ring with a glass of milk. And that's pretty plain. It's a little odd, and he would eat that every single day, pretty much. But it also tells you a bit about the era. This was the 70s, when diet food and California cuisine, so-called, was in vogue, and cottage cheese was considered a good diet food. But what's interesting is that Nixon, who had these very plain tastes, was the same guy who went over to China in 1972 and helped to open China to the Western world, and was photographed eating all sorts of exotic foods with chopsticks. And that was no mistake. He knew that this was the first state dinner, a state visit that would be televised. Barbara Walters was there, and Harry Reasoner, and they covered it live. And he knew that his dinner would be seen on every television in America. And so he practiced in secret using chopsticks over and over again. And he was not a coordinated guy, nor did he have a head for alcohol. So his advisors were a little worried. But, there he was with Zhou Enlai in this great hall filled with people and television cameras. And he was determined to use his chopsticks, and he did a good job. And it caused a huge sensation here in America. And Barbara Walters was saying, "Oh my goodness, it's the president eating with chopsticks here in China, and he's eating Chinese food." And it was a kind of a breakthrough moment that had all sorts of ripple effects. One of which was that Chinese food had a whole second wave of popularity in this country. The first wave happened after the gold rush, when a lot of Chinese came over to work on the railroads and in the gold fields in California. But then it kind of degenerated, and there was kind of this gloppy, sweet stuff that Americans liked. And then after Nixon went over in China in 1972, a lot more sophisticated Chinese cuisine popped up in America, and Sichuan and Mandarin and all sorts of Mongolian cuisine, and to this day it's one of the most popular cuisines available here, and many presidents love Chinese food. So these are the kinds of stories that led me down this winding path to this book. And I couldn't do all 46 presidents. I settled on doing 26. And my criteria were to find the most interesting food stories and the most popular presidents, because I'm trying to reach a wide audience here. And I wanted to show different aspects of the presidency and the White House and the politics behind all of this. And so I tried to make each chapter a little different, and to tell these stories as sort of illustrations of not only who these guys were as presidents, but what their era was like, what was happening in the country and also around the world, and why that was important. The American public really pays attention to what the president says and what he eats, and what he eats impacts his own health, and he's arguably the most important man in the world. And it impacts the health of the people watching him. So when Barack Obama ate arugula and emphasized exercise and planted the garden with Michelle at the White House, a lot of people started planting gardens and exercising and eating healthy food. But then when Donald Trump began to tweet out about his McBurgers and the taco bowls and pizza, a lot of people felt they had license to eat McBurgers, as they did with Bill Clinton. And so there's a great impact there. But the evolution of the presidential cuisine also is a kind of a capsule history of America. It shows us the industrialization and mechanization of America through the food. In the old days, we would eat very basic things. I mean, it was pretty good, but there were also things that we no longer eat, such as turtle soup or roasted possum or bear steaks and things like this. That squirrel stew that some people still eat, but not many. And those were considered the height of sophistication back then, and were eaten by presidents and used at state dinners. And now we think they're kind of weird or odd or maybe even disgusting in some cases. And yet we're eating highly processed foods. And so you have to wonder what the future generations are going to think of our foods.
Well, final question. You weren't able to speak to a whole lot of staff, but you were able to speak to some, and you created your own state dinner.
Yeah, I did indeed. And I'm going to show you a picture. There's FDR. He was a big foodie, although his wife was not. And there's Eleanor. There's Mrs. Nesbitt, the horrible housekeeper who created perhaps the worst meals at the White House. She looks like she's out of central casting. There's JFK. There's a Kennedy State dinner. There's another Kennedy State dinner. This is at Mount Vernon for President Ayub Khan of Pakistan. Here's a bipartisan lunch that Obama hosted. And you can see it's nothing too fancy. It's big old sandwiches with some iced tea and cookies. There is Donald Trump's famous or infamous burger banquet that he held for the Clemson football team in the state dining room, served on silver platters with Abe Lincoln looking overhead. Here is Obama with Anthony Bourdain in Hanoi, Vietnam, which was another viral moment. And here's a state dinner. So my initial interest in this subject came through Julia's television coverage of state dinners, the behind-the-scenes look that she took at what it takes to put on one. And I wanted to recreate that for this book. But sadly, the Trump administration did not welcome me. And so I decided, well, what's the next best thing? And I decided to host my own state dinner. And so I hired a former White House chef named John Mueller, great guy, who cooked 4 courses. Each dish had a story behind it. We started with a wild mushroom soup, and that was in reference to George Washington and his troops starving at Valley Forge in 1777 and foraging for mushrooms. We moved on to a delicious salmon with a horseradish crust, which was a reference to the famous presidential salmons that were sent every spring from Maine to the White House. And there's some funny stories around that. And then we had a delicious wild green salad with a wedge of Amish cheese. And that was a reference to Thomas Jefferson's fabulous salads, and the famous giant cheeses that were sent to the White House as gifts. And then we finished with a chocolate bomb dessert with raspberry sauce, and it was just fabulous. And I mean, who doesn't like chocolate? Everybody does, including the presidents. But it also, chocolate was part of the triangle trade for slaves, and so there was a dark side to that story. So it was a fabulous meal, and my guests were 10 people who had either worked at the White House or covered it for the Washington Post or were food historians, and we talked about state dinners and what it's like to actually be at one, and all the funny things that happen there and the serious things that happen there. And people get so excited that they're at a state dinner that they won't let go of the president's hand. They keep shaking it, or they complain about their seats, or they steal the silverware. And it's human nature come to life, all in this pressure cooker of the White House. And so it was a good success, and I conclude the book with that, and with the message, much like Julia's, is that I think we ought to really raise the profile of the White House food and the kitchen itself. And it's essentially in the basement now. I think we ought to bring the kitchen up, make it much bigger. It's a tiny little space now. And maybe even let the public watch the cooks at work, because food is very popular now, and they do a very high level job there. And I think it would be good politics to show the taxpayers' dollars at work. And so that's how I ended it. And by the way, I'm still trying to be invited to a state dinner. I'll let you know how it works out. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for joining us. Now, thank you. Okay. Now, at this time, we'll do Q&A. Audience, if you have questions here in the auditorium, and also online using the Q&A question at the bottom. So, sir, we got a question right here.
Two first ladies. One was Bess Truman, and the other one was Edith Wilson. What kind of state dinners do they have?
The question is Bess Truman and Edith Wilson. What kind of state dinners did they offer during their times at the White House?
Well, the role of First Lady is something that I tried to emphasize in the book. It's one of the themes that really popped out at me, because the First Lady is a very important job, even though it's unpaid. It really is a full-time job, and has become increasingly so and increasingly politicized and political. And some of these women love that, like Dolly Madison, and to a certain extent, Jackie Kennedy and Nancy Reagan. But many of them had very mixed feelings. I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt, for sure, did not really want to be First Lady, but understood that she had a bully pulpit and that she could promote her vision of strong women, working with the scientific method, eating economically, and so on. Bess Truman did not want to be First Lady. She liked her independence. She was a private person. They didn't hold a whole lot of state dinners. She was a very astute political analyst and was very helpful to Harry behind the scenes. But when people started asking her what sort of dress she was going to wear or what her recipe for Thanksgiving turkey was, she would turn it over to her staff and, just didn't want anything to do with that kind of question. Edith Wilson was also a private person, and Woodrow Wilson was one of these interesting guys. He had a very weak stomach, very nervous every time things were going badly during the First World War. He'd have terrible indigestion and he'd splitting headaches, and he would be unable to function for a while. He ate very bland food, often had kind of powdered things. One of the things that I tried that he made was his so-called healthy breakfast, which was 2 raw eggs in a glass of grape juice. And I had to steel myself when I drank that down. And I have to say, it wasn't as bad as I thought it would be, but it's not become part of my morning repertoire. But the Wilsons, were quite formal people, and they did not entertain a whole lot, and partly because it was a very stressful time during the First World War. But what's ironic to me is that here's this guy who didn't like food very much, yet his food policies were incredibly important. He, with the help of Herbert Hoover, who ran something called the Food Administration, helped to save millions of lives in Europe during the First World War and afterwards with American food aid. And the programs that they set up to ship American foods to Europe still exist today, and it's a remarkable thing. So I found in this book that there are not often, but there are sometimes presidents who are fated to undertake a job that they are ill-suited for. So John Adams, who did not like to socialize, was fated to host the first party at the White House, and he didn't like parties, but fate led him there, and he made his way through it. Woodrow Wilson, who didn't really like to eat, was fated to have this role as a very important provider of food to the world. So it's one of those ironies of the White House.
Okay, question. All right, so let's take a look online here. Let's see. Nixon and Andrew Johnson are problematic presidents at best. Did either have important dinners? Also, did a great president like Abraham Lincoln have any as well?
Andrew Johnson, not so much. Poor Andrew Johnson was Lincoln's vice president, and unfortunately, he once gave a speech in which he was slurring his words because he had a stomach flu, and the cure in those days was to take a shot of whiskey, and he did not have a good head for whiskey, and so he became known as a drunk, which was really unfair to him. But he was not an effective president either, so he didn't have too many great dinners. Nixon, as I mentioned, had a very plain palate, but when it came to the China dinner, that was a very important dinner that still resonates to this day. He had a few state dinners at the White House, not that many. He really was impatient. He didn't like to eat much himself. He would rush through his meals, and he would complain that state dinners take too long. There's a funny section about that in the book, which I'll let you read, about him rushing through, and the sort of acerbic comments from Henry Kissinger about that. I'm sorry, who was the third person we were asking about?
Abraham Lincoln.
Oh, Abraham Lincoln. Yes. Well, Lincoln, grew up on the frontier, and the Lincoln chapter I found really interesting. His favorite things to eat were cornbread or these corn cakes, raw honey right out of the hive, black coffee. He was a real frontiersman. He would hunt and fish, and his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, however, grew up in wealth. She liked to have foie gras and champagne, so they were an odd couple. She had social aspirations when they were at the White House. She bought beautiful dresses. She bought some nice furniture, and she hosted quite a few dinners, state dinners and otherwise. But it was during the Civil War when things were going badly. They stopped entertaining, and then their son Willie got sick and died in the middle of an official dinner, which was terrible. And Mary Todd would run upstairs and check on him, and meanwhile was trying to keep up a brave face at the party. One of the things that I did in the middle of the book, I have a series of color photographs. And the opening one is the menu for Lincoln's second inauguration, which is sort of infamous because this was the end of the Civil War. the Confederacy was essentially defeated. It was clear that the war was coming to an end. And so this was kind of a moment to not only celebrate his reelection, but to celebrate the end of the ending of the war. And so they had this elaborate meal at what is the old U.S. Postal Office, which is a big, beautiful building with a giant hallway. And things started out well. The crowd showed up, something like 4,000 people came. It was crazy. They began to drink and to dance and whirl around. The dining room doors were locked by mistake, and it took a while to figure out how to open them up. Finally, at midnight, they opened the doors, and the crowd surged into the dining room. And what they saw was a kind of a miraculous sight. It was a 250-foot long table just laden with beautiful food, incredible dishes that you can see in the menu that I've included in the book. And there's a whole paragraph just about the desserts alone. But the mob at that point was kind of frenzied, and they just attacked this table of beautiful food, and it turned into a food fight. They were grabbing, entire legs of lamb and carrying them overhead, and they were smushing cheese into the ground and pastry into each other's faces and ripping the curtains, and it was just mayhem. And it was the Lincolns kind of sat there and looked at this in dismay. They didn't understand what was happening. Then Abe was assassinated not too long after that. And in retrospect, one of his Secret Service guards said that night of the second inaugural, the crowd must have sensed that that Lincoln's days were over soon. The war was coming to an end, and that maybe his time in history was up. And they just wanted to grab a piece of whatever they could at that point. And there was this kind of manic energy. So I thought that was such a sort of an interesting, sad, but understandable anecdote.
Okay. Anybody have a question in the auditorium? Okay. Let's see. Okay. Want to say thank you very much. Thank you very much for joining us, Alex. Now you've extended the offer of autographed book plates for people who purchase.
Yep, I'd be happy to sign a book plate, and I can send them to Dan, and he can forward them to you. And
Right.
you buy a book. It's a book plate as a sticker with. I'll sign it, and you can stick it in the front of the book.
Yep, there's papers, you can leave your mailing address, and I'll be happy to forward the book plate to you. So thank you very much. It's a great book. I really enjoyed it, and I encourage everyone to get it. It's available pretty much anywhere, and especially for our bookseller tonight, 27th Letter Books. So thank you very much for your time, Alex, and have a good night.
You too, Dan. It was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all for coming.
All right.